Things have gone from bad to worse over the last few days for the Ukrainian defenders in southern Donbas. In two critical areas, the defenses are not performing as they should. On the northern flank of the Ukrainian headquarters of southern Donbas, and we are speaking of the town of KURAKHOVE, the defenses around what is described as the key defense hub of Stari Terny collapsed, and quite rapidly too. On the southern flank, the Russians have reached Uspenivka, which contained the only road by which the Ukrainians trapped in what is now an operational encirclement behind the Suki Yali River can escape. In fact, news has just broken that this cauldron has closed with the fall of Uspenivka due to a Ukrainian withdrawal. In recent days, several Ukrainian military observers and experts have descended into despair as they shared their concerns on Ukrainian TV. So let's get into it. Denis Popovich said that the situation in the KURAKHOVE sector is very tense now, and it is gradually deteriorating. Ukrainian troops are engaged in rearguard battles, retreating in such a way as to gain time and hopefully inflict losses on the enemy. The enemy is currently holding the KURAKHOVE-Zaporizhia highway under fire control. The Russians have come close enough to be able to fire on it. This makes it difficult to move in such conditions, he noted. If we look at the situation from a week ago and compare it to now, we can see that the KURAKHOVE SAC is shrinking and not in favor of the Ukrainian armed forces. We must recognize this, he said. The deep state map shows that Russian forces bypass the KURAKHOVE reservoir, actually seizing the northern shore and entering from the west. This allows them to cut the KURAKHOVE-Zaporizhia road as well as from other areas including Suki Yali, Constantinople, or VELIKA, Novosilka. There is a danger along the entire length of the theater of operations in the KURAKHOVE sector, he added. Dmytro Sneryov, another analyst, seemed more concerned with the fall of Stari Terny. He said as follows: "It is worth saying that the very fact of the capture of Stari Terny raises very big questions. I mean, it was a serious defense hub of the Ukrainian defense forces, and I have no answer as to how the Russian occupiers captured the settlement in a single day. But there is a persistent feeling of déjà vu when, in fact, the occupiers unexpectedly captured Novosilka, which was a rather serious defense hub for our defenders, with 3 mines. And in 2 days, we surrendered this settlement almost without a fight," he said. Mr. Sneryov also noted that the capture of Stari Terny minimizes the possibility of active defense for the Ukrainian defenders around KURAKHOVE. Therefore, these events cannot but cause, and let us say, serious concern, especially since the capture of Stari Terny creates the preconditions for actually reaching the rear of the Ukrainian group focused on the so-called industry of the KURAKHOVE thermal power plant. And this minimizes the possibility of active defense by the Ukrainian defense forces directly in KURAKHOVE itself. In addition, it is worth noting that besides the capture of Stari Terny, the occupiers are making steady progress in KURAKHOVE itself, he said. Fighting continues along Prokofiev Street, Soborna Street, and a number of high-rise buildings have been seized. Unfortunately, the occupiers are also advancing in the direction of Schevchenko, which is actually a suburb of Pokrovsk, and this creates a threat of reaching Pokrovsk directly. And accordingly, there is a possibility of a flanking maneuver with the threat of creating an operational encirclement of Ukrainian groups directly in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Ihor Frysov, a serviceman with Ukraine's 109th Assault Battalion, identified CHASIV, Myrnograd, Pokrovsk, and KURAKHOVE as the hottest spots in the Donetsk region. He was also interviewed on Ukrainian TV and said that it is difficult for our side on the front line. The Russians, he said, are pressing, using weapons, going around from different sides, trying to reach Konstantinivka through Toretsk from the Ukrainian side. On the other hand, the Russian troops are moving through CHASIV to Konstantinivka. Pokrovsk is not far away, where we are blocking certain routes with our drones and recording that the Russian occupiers are amassing their forces there. That is, the invaders are planning to attack Pokrovsk as much as possible. The fighting continues near the village of Schevchenko, which is very close to Pokrovsk. And then there is KURAKHOVE, where we know the situation is also difficult. According to the Ukrainian serviceman, the situation in the Donetsk region is very difficult, with constant fighting. There is often a shortage of drones due to their almost continuous use, as there are a lot of enemy targets both day and night. I feel that this is kind of an all-in, meaning that the Russians are throwing all their forces at these areas. As you know, they have changed the strategy a bit. They are no longer spreading their forces along the entire front line, but concentrating where they want to succeed. There are 4 to 5 hotspots in the Donetsk region: Toretsk, CHASIV, KURAKHOVE, Pokrovsk, and Myrnograd. So once again, we need to convey to the Ukrainian society that we are in the hot phase of the war, and the possibility of losing 5 cities, CHASIV, Myrnograd, Pokrovsk, KURAKHOVE, and VELIKA Novosilka, is at stake. Perhaps geopolitically, Washington or Brussels do not see anything terrible, but it is important for us because you cannot imagine how many drones, money, effort, sweat, and most importantly, our blood and lives we have lost defending these cities and positions, emphasized Mr. Frusov. In summary, the Ukrainian armed forces in southern Donbas are trying to simultaneously protect the cities of KURAKHOVE, the village of VELIKA Novosilka, and the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk, for which the advancing units of the Russian armed forces attack at first opportunity. But the Ukrainian defense continues to break up into unrelated parts. Units of the armed forces of Ukraine were almost, if not completely, surrounded south of KURAKHOVE in the valley of the Suki Yali River. Another group is fighting fierce street battles in KURAKHOVE itself, despite the fact that Russian troops bypassed the city from several sides. The armed forces of Ukraine could not contain the Russian breakthrough south of Pokrovsk. There, the armed forces of the Russian Federation advanced 10 kilometers and cut off an important road. Finally, with desperate counterattacks, Ukrainian units are trying to push back Russian troops, trying to surround VELIKA Novosilka. And the only positive news for the Ukrainian armed forces in this medley of negativity and pessimism comes on the northern flank of VELIKA Novosilka. The armed forces of the Russian Federation had broken through to the eastern outskirts of this fortified settlement, the district center on the border of Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions, which for years blocked the Russian army's way to a vast area southeast of the city of Dnipro. At the same time, another Russian group made a breakthrough north of VELIKA Novosilka, captured the village of Rozdony, and tried to cut off the road connecting the district center with the rear of the armed forces of Ukraine near the village of Novyi Komar. The armed forces of Ukraine counterattacked units of the Russian armed forces in Novyi Komar, and according to sources on both sides, were able to knock the Russians out of the village. Specifically, Ukrainian expert Sergei Gurets commented that the Russian troops were driven out by the soldiers of Ukraine's 48th Separate Assault Battalion sometime around the 5th of December. They reported that they were clearing the Russian remnants in Novyi Komar. In reality, it was a team effort. Alongside the 40th Separate Assault Battalion, units from the 51st Separate Mechanized Brigade, tank crews from the 23rd Separate Mechanized Brigade, and drone operators played crucial roles. Notably, the operators from the VRI Company of Unmanned Attack Drones in the 241st Brigade of the Territorial Defense Forces performed exceptionally well. This was at least some positive news, but it is understood that the Russians will likely regroup and launch renewed assaults on VELIKA Novosilka. The most dangerous direction remains the northeast, in particular between the Kasalak and Shaitanka rivers, where Russian forces took the road to the east of the settlement. Thus, it is clear that the fighting around VELIKA Novosilka will persist, as this settlement holds significant strategic importance for the Russians, and both sides recognize this. In addition to pushing the Russians out of Novyi Komar, the Skala Assault Battalion conducted similar operations in Rozdoni, which has been under Russian control for some time. This suggests that the military command has bolstered Ukrainian units with assault battalions to significantly hinder the Russian advance toward VELIKA, Novosilka. However, if the armed forces of Ukraine lose control over the road, Ukrainian units defending VELIKA, Novosilka may repeat the fate of the defenders of Selidove and other settlements of the Donbas. That is, they will have to leave their positions under the threat of encirclement and in the conditions of an ongoing frontal assault. The Russian armed forces are already attacking head-on the southern outskirts of the village after the capture of the neighboring village of Blahodatny. Now, there was a gap between VELIKA, Novosilka and KURAKHOVE in the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. In the near future, the Russian armed forces will probably be able to advance from Rozdolny not only to the south, that is, to the district center, but also to the north, in the direction of the important Donetsk-Zaporizhia road. After weeks of heavy fighting, the command of the Russian armed forces was able to implement almost all plans to loosen the Ukrainian defense around KURAKHOVE. Russian troops captured the entire northern shore of the KURAKHOVE reservoir, the city itself being located on the southern bank. After that, parts of the Russian armed forces reached the western end of the reservoir. Ukrainian sources report that the enemy approached the reservoir-forming dam on the Vovcha River in the village of Stari Terny. If the Russian armed forces force the river, they will be able to attack in the direction of the Donetsk-Zaporizhia road. This is the last way connecting KURAKHOVE with the mainland. South of KURAKHOVE, Russian troops reached the village of Ospennivka, through which the only way to supply the Ukrainian army passes in the valley of the Suki Yali River. The armed forces of Ukraine are leaving the valley in a hurry. In just a few days, they lost the villages of Yelisavetovka, Ilinka, and Romanivka on the riverbank, and the latest reports suggest several other villages have collapsed. Finally, in the center of KURAKHOVE, the armed forces of Ukraine are trying to repel frontal attacks of the Russian armed forces. Russian troops have already managed to capture all the eastern outskirts with low-rise buildings and part of the high-rise buildings in the center.
АГС! Гранаты кидай, давай стреляй! Гранаты кидай! Граната! Слышу.
And now the last area we want to talk about is the CHASIV front. There are advances in certain areas across the canal. The Russians are being engaged, but the dynamics around CHASIV remain extremely difficult. These were the words of Ivan Petrchak, a spokesman for the 24th Separate Mechanized Brigade, which is holding the line in the Bakhmut sector, defending CHASIV. He said, "The situation has hardly changed over the past week. The Russians continue to exert pressure using all available resources to push deeper into our brigade's area of responsibility. We are holding back the attacks and holding the line, but the situation is difficult. The Russian troops continue to actively destroy everything around CHASIV, as well as the town itself. The Russians are actively using artillery, swarms of drones that circle over the positions round the clock, complicating logistics and air bombs. As for counteracting these drones, electronic warfare means that the work of Russian drones undoubtedly exists. However, the effectiveness of these means depends on the Russian delivery system and the pilot's skill, which is increasing daily," he said. As for the refactory plant, the situation there, as well as throughout the entire area of responsibility, is dynamic and complex, Petrchak says. The Russian enemy is trying to occupy the plant, cross the Seversky Donetsk-Donbas Canal, exert influence and gain a foothold there. However, the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to stop them before the occupiers approach their positions. The Russians want to occupy this plant because it is a full-fledged fortification with Soviet-built concrete flood walls. Earlier on our brigade's YouTube channel, he said, he conducted a video tour of this plant which showed its condition. It is badly damaged, but it can still be used as a fortification, he added. The Russians are using both small assault groups and armored vehicles in the sector, Petrchak said. Small infantry groups are trying to run behind the canal to remain less visible, move around, accumulate and engage us in small arms battles. Then they use vehicles in large numbers. Up to 7 armored vehicles can drive in with infantry. In the most recent assault, 7 Russian armored personnel carriers entered and were destroyed. The main striking force in the assault groups are Russian paratroopers, in particular the 98th Division, which is fighting against us. Remote mining is actively being used, mainly in the Grey Zone and Russian logistic routes. The war is now being waged for logistics because without it, the army's combat power is reduced. In addition to the drones, I would like to recognize our sappers who are doing their job heroically, he said. They are carrying anti-tank mines and planting them in the most likely places of the Russian advance. Climate and weather changes, fogs are now favorable to the work of sappers, which they do perfectly. This is confirmed by the last assault, he claims, when the Russians tried to break through on the armored personnel carrier, but were met by minefields first. In addition to minefields, other obstacles are used very effectively. But, he said, the enemy is also conducting reconnaissance. If they see the barriers, they try to bypass them and look for another way, said Petachak.